I began to realize that the evidence for the existence of God, while not proof, was actually pretty interesting. And it certainly made me realize that atheism would no longer be for me an acceptable choice, that it was the least rational of the options.
This video that we're about to watch features the renowned scientist Francis Collins, who sat as the director of the group that successfully completed the Human Genome Project. In this video, Collins explains why, as a scientist, he came to believe in God. This video has a few really interesting arguments in it that I want to unpack a bit more on the back end as well, so stick around for that. But in the meantime, let's dive in.
I won't go through the whole chronology as it actually happened, but let me summarize for you the kinds of arguments that ultimately brought me around to the position of recognizing that belief in God was an entirely satisfying intellectually event, but also something that I was increasingly discovering I had a spiritual hunger for. And interestingly, some of the pointers to God had been in front of me all along, coming from the study of nature. And I hadn't really thought about them, but here they were. Here's one which seems like an obvious statement, but maybe it's not so obvious. There is something instead of nothing. No reason that should be. This phrase of Wigner, the Nobel laureate in physics, caught my eye because I had been involved, of course, as a graduate student working with quantum mechanics with Schrödinger's equation. And one of the things that had appealed to me so much about mathematics and physics and chemistry was how it was that this particular kind of depiction of matter and energy works. I mean, it really works well. And a theory that is correct often turns out to be simple and beautiful. And why should that be? Why should mathematics be so unreasonably effective in describing nature? There's the Big Bang. The fact that the universe had a beginning, as virtually all scientists are now coming to the conclusion, about 13.7 billion years ago, in an unimaginable singularity, where the universe, smaller than a golf ball, suddenly appeared and then began flying apart and has been flying apart ever since. And we can calculate that singularity by noticing just how far those galaxies are receding from us and things like the background microwave radiation, the echo of that Big Bang. And of course, that presents a difficulty because our science cannot look back beyond that point. And it seems that something came out of nothing. Well, nature isn't supposed to allow that. So if nature's not able to create itself, how did the universe get here?
You know, these pockets are collapsing, and it was fairly well cold not too long ago, under the Earth's surface. But now the whole Earth is warmed up, so the surface has to warm up. When that does, your enzymes start to get active and break down the biology, and then things collapse. And that's what's happening. Now, we're going to go through this, but I call him Scorpzilla because he's got a scorpion pincher right there. I'm going to show you this, and there's no way to deny this as far as I'm concerned. If you can, deny it after I show you the details. Right there is where he poops. Crowley Lake is his beard. There's his eye. That's his shoulders. Now let's take a look at it without the screen. All right, we take off all those little details. You look at it and you say, oh, there's nothing there. Well, I am going to show you those details at the spot where they are. Just like the pincher. Let's just start with the pincher. That's his tail coming out. And that ridge right there, all the way along there, is where the venom comes out, all the way down here, right out through that stinger. And he squirted out when he died, apparently. Now, you see this wrinkle zone here? When this thing was retracted, it would almost lay flat, because that's nothing more than muscle. When that thing twisted back, it would twist just back like this. And something gets in between this area here, twang, done. Squirting juice like you wouldn't believe how. Now that's a scorpion stinger. I don't care, you can say anything you want. And it looks like it was trying to do something here because that tip did hit this here, it looks to me. That looks like an impact right there. You see it pushed up? It looks like it twanged into there. Now, what this is, I don't know, but I'm going to tell you what, I believe it's another creature of some sort. Whenever you see these edges like this and these extreme drop-offs, there's something was here. I don't know what it was. But there's a lot of action going on here, whatever this thing is. The whole world is covered with creatures. Now, that's the shoulder right up there. All right, they were offshore right in here, looking apparently at these structures that are down on the surface. I mean, on the floor. And they came back with those detailed pictures that look like buildings to me. I don't know. I have no idea. But I can tell you what, this is Scorbzilla. And right up there is where he poops. It's Mount Spurr. Now look at this. You see where I am here? Let's come right down on here. This is just his whole side of his body going down. And these are actually probably, if you could see well enough, you could probably see scales or some kind of, well, you see wrinkly looking stuff coming down. Now, let's start at the top of his body here. The elevation's minus 146 meters. So we got to go 146 meters down to get to there. Now, over the top of his body down here, it's minus 4,600 meters. It's 4,000 meters. That's 12,000, 13,000 feet. That's miles. And the whole thing is like that. The whole thing is exactly the same. This is his body, and over the edge is the sea floor that he was laying on, whatever that is. Now, somewhere there's got to be a beginning to this, and they're laying on top of it. Where that beginning is, I don't know. Is that another creature under there? I don't know. But I can guarantee you this is. And so is the one in North Africa. Now, this is his head, and there's his eyeball, right there. And there's his eyebrow. Just let that sink in for a minute. Just look at what you're looking at. That's just a hill country. That's just hills, and all that stuff just happened all by itself. I don't think so, monsieur. That is the guy's eyebrow. And there's his eyeball. And right over here is where his beard is, Lake Crowley. It's all these huge round beard. And there's no explanation for any of those things other than the explanation that I have just given you. That's what's squirting down that stinger. And that's why every one of these is a stratovolcano. They all have that stinger juice in them. All the way down, all the way down, all the way down, all the way. And they're all over the place. And they're not just here for nothing. They're there because it's swelling up, and they get earthquakes here regularly. And volcanoes. So this is an extremely reactive and active area up here. See this stuff? I mean, it takes a while to settle in. These are not the colors, but there could be some strange colors in here because this is toxic waste. And that's supposed to come out of that stinger and squirt into whoever he was stinging. And there's a pin right there. You see that? That's basically a pin. And this thing retracts into these folds. So if you took this and just brought it right back in here, you'd be all set to sting. And that's the tip right there. It changes. You can see it actually changes from here into whatever this is, which is the stinger ejector. And all of that tube is where that stuff is running to facilitate the jab. There were Scorpius, I think was the name of one of them. It was a scorpion dragon, I guess. This is absolutely, definitely some kind of a dragon reptile with a scorpion pincher. And the rest, I don't know. But I'm going to show you his beard. And I showed you his eyebrows and his eye. And I'll show you Mount Spurr, which is the rectum. I mean, I'm just sorry. That's what it is. Okay, a couple things I have learned from this is he was red-blooded, because that's a black and the red is from the colors of the blood. We all know that we're Mudfossil people. These are hairs, and you almost always have very fine skin where you have hair. It's not through anything coarse and nasty normally. All right, so like I say, Lake Crowley, these are his beard. Now, Typhon has a completely different beard, totally different. I'll show you that, but they all just seem to have beards, and there's a ton of them around. And Quetzalcoatl has a beard too. I mean, they all did. Okay, these are not my words. This was out today. This era are now deep underwater. And that's what they say. It was inhabited, but now it's deep underwater because of basically settling. And I'm going to show you right now. All right, they're talking about stone structures, and they think they sunk or whatever. Now they're deep underwater. Well, let's look at what they did find when they did that scan. I think I might have showed you, but you're going to see it again. All right, they say these are stone structures. Now, they can get a pretty good feel for the actual texture. And they're showing these as they look like buildings, but I don't think they're buildings. I think those are, what I'm about to show you, living biological tendon tissue being torn apart. That's why we're having these faults. All right, everybody's seen these things here, Giant's Causeway and Finnegal's Cave and so forth. Those are tendon fibrils from a gigantic creature, absolutely stunningly large, just as you saw Scorpzilla. That thing is way over 1,000 miles long. And it's going to have tendons to work those extremely heavy body parts. And these are the kind of tendons you would have. And if they ripped apart, I'll show you what it looks like when they do rip apart. Now, as crazy as this sounds, there's hex-type tendons, yes, and I'm not exactly sure where those are in the human body, but they get changed. They change from squares. So first, well, let me show you what the anatomical is. Well, here's one right here, and they break off flat as a pancake because they're in little tiny squares. There's a tiny squares all the way down, and they break off just as flat as this. That's why you see them in those flat pancake-looking things. Now, these are the end fascially down here. Now, you see here, it starts off as a rope style, then it's squares, then they turn into round, but there's a bazillion of them in here, and then there's a bazillion of these in here, and a zillion of those here, and you get down to these little tiny fibers. And that's what makes up basically the Earth. I need to say about it, so I'm going to say it. All right, so let's get ready to find out what they had to say in the ancient text. This thing is eating somebody. Now, I'm telling you right now, if you can show me that I'm wrong, I'd like to know why. This right here is exactly what you just saw. There's his beards, there's his head, which is a different type of material than the runoff, which is the bloody stuff, turns red. Feathers are always, it turns green because it's loaded with red blood. Anytime red blood runs off, it turns green. Anytime you have feathers, they turn extremely green. This is the shape of his head because it's a different material. Now, up here, it runs all the way up. the East Coast. And right up here, you can still see his feathers. Now, I'm going to go into a big, long ramble after I tell you what Quetzalcoatl was in history. Very, very important creature in the history of Mesoamerica, extremely important. These are his feathers, and that's why they're the Green Mountains. Feather meal, they sell ground up feathers to make things grow green. And there's his head, and he's spitting something out that makes things grow, that makes things very noxious in this area. Now, they say it's runoff from farming. Let's discuss the whole thing after we find out who was Quetzalcoatl. All right, let's go and see what they say about Quetzalcoatl. Let's get the details of what history said about him. Okay, so what does ChatGPT have to say about Quetzalcoatl and its history? So I said, what is the background history of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent? It seems you're asking about Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, a prominent deity in Mesoamerican cultures. Here's an overview of the background historical significance of Quetzalcoatl. Name and representation. Quetzalcoatl is an Aztec language. Name combines two words, Quetzal referring to a beautiful feathered bird, and Coatl meaning serpent. So it's the feathered serpent. He's depicted as a serpent adorned with feathers or wings, symbolized by the connection between earth and the heavens. The serpent and the bird. Earth and the heavens? I don't know. Could be. Origin in Mesoamerican cultures. Quetzalcoatl was not unique to the Aztecs. He was a key figure in several of these cultures in this area, the Mesoamerican area, with each culture adding its own interpretations and characteristics. Now, that's going to be important to start thinking about, because was he working for one set of them against the others? Was he equally taking care of everybody? Was he against everybody? Well, was he just against the giants? Let's look into this. So now, they all had a different idea about him, but he's the same guy. That's just the way it is now today about everything. Now, Toltecs. The earliest significant association with Quetzalcoatl comes from the Toltec civilization. That was 900 to 1168 in this common era. All right, this isn't BC, this is this time. That's only 1,300 years ago. In Toltec religion, Quetzalcoatl was regarded as a creator god and cultural hero. Okay, so he was a good guy. And that's in the Toltecs. He was a good guy. Now, the Teotihuacan in the city of Teotihuacan. Now, this goes back to BC, 100 BC to 750 CE. A god related to the feathered serpent was prominent. Though scholars, here we go again, scholars debate whether this figure was exactly Quetzalcoatl or a similar deity with similar symbolisms. Well, Quetzalcoatl, I think, was the guy. He's pretty big. Now, the Aztecs, they flourished from 14th century in the common era now to early 16th century. The culture most associated with Quetzalcoatl. That's only a few hundred years ago. That's not long ago at all. In their mythology, Quetzalcoatl was considered one of the Olympian gods, just like the Titans. It was often referred to as the god of wind, rain, learning, and life itself. Wow. The role in Aztec mythology. In Aztec culture, Quetzalcoatl was part of a complex pantheon. He had all kinds of them, I guess. Some of his roles included creator deity. He was thought to have played a role in the creation of humanity. One popular myth has him descending to the underworld to gather the bones of the ancient ancestors from which he and his brother, Quetzalcoatl, another important Aztec god, created the first humans. Yikes. He was the god of wind and rain, associated with natural elements of wind and rain essential for agriculture especially growing maize and corn, which was a staple crop of the Mesoamerican civilizations. I show his body laying there is actually changes the weather patterns. I'm not kidding you. I'll show it to you. The weather patterns are sitting right on top of his body, and that's where Tornado Alley is, because of his body. Now, the myth of Quetzalcoatl's departure, the myth, now, let's see. One of the most famous legends about Quetzalcoatl involves his departure, according to Aztec mythology. They call this a myth. Okay, a little interruption here, but back at it here. So, this is the myth about Quetzalcoatl's departure. They call it a myth. Now, here's what they're saying. This is one of the most famous legends. According to the Aztecs, Quetzalcoatl was said to have been overthrown, or he was tricked, by his brother, the god Tezcatlipoca. And in despair, he left the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan and journeyed to the east. Before leaving, he promised he would one day return. Well, let's see. That could very well be. This myth took on political significance in the years leading up to the arrival of Hernan Cortes in 1519. That's because they thought he was Quetzalcoatl. The Aztecs, having heard of the returning god through their own prophecies, believed the Spanish conquistadors were potentially the returning Quetzalcoatl, though this belief is likely an oversimplification or even a misunderstanding by later interpreters. And he was an actual creature that is now the east coast of the United States. Okay, my friends, everybody knows what feathers look like, most people. And I would say that's a feather. Now, let's come down and take a look at it closer here. I don't think anybody dug these in that particular manner like that, with these ribs and so forth in it. And you can see an enormous amount of green foliage surrounding this, because feathers produce a lot of green. And this is not just one. They're all over the place up here, because this is parts of Quetzalcoatl's, the back of his head, right up in here. Well, the top of his head. Now, this is Quetzalcoatl. You have to take your time and look at it, and don't let your mind go crazy, because it is. It's crazy. I'm not saying it's not crazy. Everything I say is crazy, but it's true. So
another thing I began to realize by a little more reading is that there is this phenomenal fine-tuning of the universe that makes complexity and therefore life possible. Those of you who study physics and chemistry will know that there's a whole series of laws that govern the behavior of matter and energy. They are simple, beautiful equations, but they have constants in them, like the gravitational constant or the speed of light. And you cannot derive at the present time the value of those constants. They are what they are. They're givens. You have to do the experiment and measure them. Well, suppose they were a little different. Would that matter? Would anything change in our universe if the gravitational constant was a little stronger or a little weaker? Some days I think it's a little stronger, but I don't think it really is. So that calculation got done, particularly in the 1970s, by Barrow and Tipler, and the answer was astounding. That if you take any of these 15 constants and you tweak them just a tiny little bit, the whole thing doesn't work anymore. Take gravity, for instance. If gravity was just 1 part in about 10 billion weaker than it actually is, then after the Big Bang, there would be insufficient gravitational pull to result in the coalescence of stars and galaxies and planets and you and me. And you'd end up, therefore, with an infinitely expanding sterile universe. If gravity was just a tiny bit stronger, well, things would coalesce all right, but a little too soon. and the Big Bang would be followed after a while by a big crunch, and we would not have the chance to appear because the timing wouldn't be right. And that's just one example. You can't look at that data and not marvel at it. It is astounding to see the knife edge of improbability upon which our existence exists. So what's that about? Well, I can think of three possibilities. First of all, maybe theory will someday tell us that these constants have to have the value they have, that there is some a priori reason for that. Most physicists I talk to don't think that's too likely. There might be relationships between them that have to be maintained, but not the whole thing. A second possibility, perhaps we are one of an almost infinite series of other universes that have different values of those constants, and of course we have to be in the one where everything turned out right or we wouldn't be having this conversation. So that's the multiverse hypothesis, and it is a defensible one as long as you're willing to accept the fact that you will probably never be able to observe those infinite series of other parallel universes. So that requires quite a leap of faith. The third possibility is that this is intentional, that these constants have the value they do because that creator God, who is a good mathematician, also knew that there was an important set of dials to set here if this universe that was coming into being was going to be interesting. So take those three possibilities, and which of them seems most plausible? Apply Occam's razor, if you will, which says that the simplest explanation is most likely correct. Well, I come down on number three. We get there. Well, now we come back to Lewis in that first chapter of Mere Christianity, which is called Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. And here what is being talked about is the moral law. I didn't take philosophy in college, so I didn't really quite know what this was all about. But as I began to recognize what the argument was, it rang true. It rang true in a really startling way. One of those things where you realize, I've known about this all my life, but I've never really quite thought about it. So what's the argument? The argument is that we humans are unique in the animal kingdom by apparently having a law that we are under, although we seem free to break it because that happens every day. And the law is that there's something called right and there's something called wrong, and we're supposed to do the right thing and not the wrong thing. Again, we break that law. When we do, what do? We make an excuse, which only means we believe the law must be true and we're trying to be let off the hook. Now, people will quickly object, now wait a minute. I can think of human cultures that did terrible things. How can you say they were under the moral law? Well, if you go and study those cultures, you will find out that the things that we consider terrible were in their column called right because of various cultural expectations. So clearly the moral law is universal, but it is influenced in terms of particular actions and how they size up in the right and wrong assessment. So for instance, if you're being altruistic to your own family, you can see how that might make sense from an evolutionary perspective because they share your DNA. So if you're helping their DNA survive, well, it's yours too. And so that makes sense from a Darwinian argument about reproductive fitness. If you are being nice to somebody in expectation they'll be nice to you later, a reciprocal form of altruism, well, okay, you could see how that might also make sense in terms of benefiting your reproductive success. You can even make arguments, as Martin Nowak has at Harvard, that if you do computer modeling of things like the prisoner's dilemma, you can come up with motivations for entire groups to behave altruistically toward each other. But a consequence of that, and all the other models that have been put together, is that you still have to be hostile to people who are not in your group. Otherwise, the whole thing falls apart as far as the evolutionary drive for successful competition. Where are those circumstances where we think the moral law has been most dramatically at work? I would submit they are not when we're being just nice to our family, or just nice to people who are going to be nice to us, or even just when we're being nice to other people in our own group. The things that strike us, that cause us to marvel and to say, that's what human nobility is all about, are when that radical altruism extends beyond those categories. When you see Mother Teresa and the streets of Calcutta picking up the dying, when you see Oskar Schindler risking his life to save Jews from the Holocaust, when you see the Good Samaritan, or when you see Wesley Autry. Wesley Autry, a construction worker, African-American, standing on the subway platform in New York City, and next to him, a young man, a graduate student, went into an epileptic seizure, and to the horror of everybody standing there, the student fell onto the tracks in front of an oncoming train. With only a split second to make a decision, Wesley jumped onto the tracks as well, pulled the student, still having the seizure, in that small space in between the tracks, covered him with his own body, and the train rolled over both of them. And miraculously, there was just enough clearance for them both to survive. And here's a picture of the next day as Wesley describes the situation, standing next to the young man's father. This was clearly radical altruism. These people were of no acquaintance of each other, had no likelihood of seeing each other in any other circumstance, and belonged to different groups as we seem to define them here in our society, one being African American, one being white. And yet, New York went crazy, and they should. What an amazing act. What an amazing, risky thing to do. Now, evolution would say, Wesley, what were you thinking? Talk about ruining your reproductive fitness opportunities. This is a scandal, isn't it? So think about that. Again, I'm not offering you a proof, but I do think when people try to argue that morality can be fully explained on evolutionary grounds, that's a little bit too easy. That's a little bit too much of a just so story. And perhaps it might ought to be thought about as potentially having some other reflected reason for its presence. And I would ask the question, because Lewis asked it in his chapter, if you were looking not just for evidence of a God who was a mathematician and a physicist, but a God who cared about human beings and who stood for what was good and holy and wanted his people to also be interested in what is good and holy, wouldn't it be interesting to find written in your own heart this moral law which doesn't otherwise make sense and which is calling you to do just that? That made a lot of sense to me. So after going through these arguments over the course of a couple of years, and it was that long, fighting them, oftentimes wishing that I had never started down this road because it was leading me a place I wasn't sure I wanted to go, I began to realize that I had a certain series of but I had to figure out then, okay, if there is the possibility of this kind of God and a God who cares about humans, what is that God really like? And now it was time to go back to the world's religions and try to figure out what they tell us about that. And as I read through them, now somewhat better prepared, I could see there were great similarities between the great monotheistic religions, and they actually resonated quite well with each other about many of the principles, and I found that quite gratifying and was a bit surprised because I had assumed that they were radically different. But there were differences. Now, about this time, I had also arrived at a point that was actually not comforting, which was the realization that if the moral law was a pointer to God, and if God was good and holy, I was not. And as much as I tried to forgive myself for actions that were not consistent with that moral law, they kept popping up. And therefore, just as I was beginning to perceive the person of God in this sort of blurry way, that image was receding because of my own failures. And I began to despair of whether this would ever be a relationship that I could claim or hope to have because of my own shortcomings. And into that area of increasing anxiety came the realization that there is a person in one of these faiths who has the solution to that. But there were differences. Now, about this time, I had also arrived at a point that was actually not comforting, which was the realization that if the moral law was a pointer to God, and if God was good and holy, I was not. And as much as I tried to forgive myself for actions that were not consistent with that moral law, they kept popping up. And therefore, just as I was beginning to perceive the person of God in this sort of blurry way, that image was receding because of my own failures. And I began to despair of whether this would ever be a relationship that I could claim or hope to have because of my own shortcomings. Sacrificial act, died on the cross, and then rose from the dead to provide this bridge between my imperfections and God's holiness in a way that made more sense than I ever dreamed it could. I had heard those phrases about Christ died for your sins, and I thought that was so much gibberish, and suddenly it wasn't gibberish at all.
The wind in your hair, all you ever need, we can get anywhere. And take one last look at the place you were leaving. Take one last look, oh, take one last look at the place you are leaving. Take one last look. Take one last